dressing up the boomers as these older women who are depriving younger people of housing is just one of the thousands of ways where they use the stereotype of older women as hateful figures to perpetuate this divide between younger people and older people.
This is Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children, and I'm your host, Jane Gilmore. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording, the Wurundjeri people, and recognise that words alone are not enough to close the gap caused by invasion and colonisation. I ask you to join me in action as well as words in acknowledging this by doing things like giving to Aboriginal legal services, or if you can't do that, reading, listening, or watching art, analysis and research produced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This podcast is a series of 6 episodes loosely based on my book, Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children. You don't need to read the book to listen to the podcast, although of course I would be thrilled if you did buy the book. If you're in Australia, I'd love it if you could buy it directly from my website, janegilmore.com, links in the show notes, because that helps me keep the lights on, but you can also get it at any online bookseller. For the book, I rewrote from a feminist perspective 5 traditional fairy tales: Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast. When I was writing the book, it became very clear that there were dominant themes in each of those 5 stories. Snow White is telling women to fear and hate getting older. Cinderella is about women's unpaid and undervalued work. Sleeping Beauty is about consent, of course. The Little Mermaid is about being silenced and the power of having a voice. And Beauty and the Beast is laying the script for coercive control. These 5 topics are so important to how we understand the gendered nature of poverty and violence, and it felt like the perfect structure for a podcast. I found some truly amazing people who are experts on each topic to help me explore how the myths interact with reality and modern life. Please subscribe or follow the show through your podcast app so you can listen to all of them. This is the first episode, and we're going to start with the Snow White story. The Disney animated movie, which was released about 80 years ago, was based on the Grimm brothers' fairy tale published in the early 1800s, which in turn was adapted from much older Germanic folklore. It's easy to think this long history means the story has no relevance today, but Disney is releasing a new version of Snow White in 2025. I really hope they've made some major changes to the plot because the original story is horrific. And by the way, Disney didn't invent sanitising fairy tales. The Grimm brothers wanted to emphasise their version of wholesome family life, so in their book, they turned most of folklore's evil mothers into evil stepmothers. But in the original story, a wicked queen looks into a magic mirror every day to ask if she is the most beautiful woman in the land. Every time she asks, the mirror says yes, until her daughter, Snow White, turns 7, when it says the little girl is more beautiful than her mother. The wicked queen is so overcome by envy and hatred that she tells a huntsman to take her 7-year-old daughter into the forest, kill her, cut out her lungs and liver, and bring them back to the queen so she can eat them. This, she believes, is what she needs to do to keep herself looking young and beautiful. The huntsman is such a good man that he can't bring himself to kill a little girl and tells her to run off into the forest where he hopes she'll be eaten by wild animals. He kills the deer, takes its lungs and liver back for the queen's age-defying dinner, and lives happily ever after. Snow White, meanwhile, is in the forest, lost and terrified, until she meets what the Grimm brothers and Disney called the 7 dwarves, who scratch out a living mining ores and minerals in the local mountains. In my story, I called them miners. The miners are delighted to find a girl who can do all their domestic labour and tell her that she can stay in their cottage. The magic mirror, meanwhile, tells the queen that Snow White is still alive, so she changes herself into an ugly old crone and gives Snow White a poison apple. The first bite lodges in her throat. Everyone thinks she's dead, and the miners build a special glass coffin to put her in. A handsome prince comes riding along, as they so often do, sees a dead 7-year-old girl in a glass coffin and instantly falls in love. He demands that the miners give him the corpse so he can gaze at it whenever he wants. As the coffin is moved, the apple dislodges and Snow White wakes up. The handsome prince immediately demands that she marries him, and 7-year-old Snow White, just awakened from a coma, is apparently delighted to marry an adult man she's only just met. They celebrate the wedding by forcing the wicked queen to wear burning hot iron slippers and dance until she falls down dead for the entertainment of the wedding guests. This is typical of children's fairy tales, which were supposed to teach them how to be a good person in the world. All fairy tales have a villain, and in almost all of them, the villain is a jealous older woman. Evil stepmothers, malevolent fairies, and most of all, wicked witches are the antagonists the fairy tale princess must overcome so she can find and marry her handsome prince. Even now, wicked witches are a familiar villain for children. It's still one of the most popular Halloween costumes for children in the US and increasingly in Australia. The Wicked Witch is evil, old, ugly, and she wants to eat children. Sometimes she'll cook them first, but cannibalism is her signature move. This myth comes from the real-life witch hunts that happened across Europe for hundreds of years before the Grimm brothers published their fairy tales. It's difficult to know the exact number, but somewhere around 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, usually by burning them alive. Around 80% of those people were women, and most of those women were over 50, which at the time was considered very old. When you read the notes from witch trials, and a surprising number of those notes survive, they sound like something from a B-grade Netflix series. Witnesses would swear they saw these old women flying through the skies on broomsticks, turning into wolves, having sex with devils, and eating children. Women accused of being witches were almost always tortured until they confessed. If they recanted the confession afterwards, as many of them did, they'd be tortured again, both as punishment for recanting and to get them to reinstate the confession. It was a time of monumental social and economic change, which always creates fear. But in the grand follow-the-money tradition, there was also, of course, a profit motive in whipping up fear. Everyone involved in finding witches, torturing a confession out of them, and then burning them at the stake had to get paid. If the woman's family had money, which many of them actually did, they would get an invoice for her capture, her transport to prison, the ropes that bound her, and the knives used to cut out her tongue after she confessed, up to and including the wood used to burn her alive, were all on the invoice. If the family didn't have any money or wouldn't pay, the town would be taxed to pay all the costs of burning women alive. This was a really profitable business. Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed Witchfinder General of England, retired a very wealthy man after he tortured and executed hundreds of witches in the mid-1600s. Reading the confessions is really interesting too. In an age where most people didn't travel outside their home village, there are remarkable similarities in the confessions across hundreds of years and hundreds of miles. From England to Germany, almost all of them involved sex. So-called witches confessed to having sex with demons and devils, using witchcraft to force men to have sex with them, or to wither their penis, or even steal men's penises so they could be given to Satan as a present. I couldn't actually find any records of men who could prove that their penises had been stolen and given to Satan, but proof wasn't really required in witch trials. Many confessions included a lot of kissing the devil's naked bottom as proof of witchcraft. God and the devil were very real presences in everyday lives back then, so it was entirely believable that the devil would want to have sex with humans and that this sex would involve what was seen as perversion. Lesbians, of course, were witches by definition, but it was older, single, childless women who were the most common target. They were vulnerable with no family to protect them and no man to speak for them. And again, the profit motive. In village life, they were seen as a drain on the community funds because they weren't raising a new generation of workers or contributing to the upkeep of current workers. When a witchfinder comes to town and you know he's going to take someone, the easiest targets were older, single, childless women. When you distill all that history of real-life witch killings, you get the mythical witch of fairy tales, the older woman consorting with the forces of evil out of hatred and jealousy. She's prone to eating babies, cursing men's penises, and kissing Satan's ass. When I was planning this podcast, there was only one person I wanted for this episode, and that's Yumi Lee, the CEO of the Older Women's Network. Yumi has been a peace and women's rights activist for many years, and I first heard her speak at a domestic violence conference years ago. She was so articulate and knowledgeable about the way older women are erased and dismissed from public life. She was so good at explaining the devastating effects that this can have, I knew there was no one better to help me explore this topic. Welcome, Yumi. Let's dive right in. The cornerstone of the Wicked Witch myth is what we now call rampant ageism. Can you talk to me a little bit about what ageism looks like in Australia now?
How long have you got, Jean? You know, we can talk till Christmas about how older women are invisibilized, how they are stereotyped, how they're discriminated against. There's a whole long list, and I'll start right from the most basic, and that is looking at the housing situation of older women. We have a growing cohort of older women who are retiring into poverty and retiring into homelessness because of their personal circumstance, where many of them have been carers and they don't have that wonderful nest egg of a superannuation or savings. And for a lot of them whose relationships have broken up, just like my mother, they don't have enough money to buy another home. And so they end up homeless. My mother, for example, she divorced my father at the age of 72. One may well ask why she waited that long. She was given a little pot of money, and unfortunately, she was not very wise with that. And she's effectively homeless, like thousands of others, some of whom sleep in their cars, some of them couch surf, etc. So the real implications of discriminating against a cohort through your policies of taxation, through your social policies, all of that result in this group who is neglected and forgotten. And here in New South Wales, for example, you have to be 80 years old, that's 80 years old, to even be considered for the priority waiting list, which is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, wow. And most women are retiring in their 50s, often
Yes.
because they don't have a choice, because they're actually pushed out of the workforce because of that enduring myth that older women can't be useful, can't be energetic, can't be creative, can't deal with new technology, can't be reliable, can't be forceful, can't be ambitious, all those sort of things. We're supposed to be at home knitting and baking cookies for the grandkids, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
That story about your mother, Yumi, and I'm so sorry that happened to her, but that story about her, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, of a lifetime of unpaid work that results in an older age of poverty. And that lifetime of unpaid work, which is worth like $1 trillion to the economy, all that unpaid work that women do, that women, particularly of your mother's generation, were just expected to do. And the repayment for that is, well, you didn't earn any money, so sucks to be you, go sleep in your car. And because, again, older women are so erased and dismissed, it's just not something that anybody can make into an issue that people will care about.
Yes, I think one of the most stark examples of this is in aged care. Aged care is actually gendered because the majority of people who live in aged care are older women. I think nearly 70% who live residential and aged care are older women. And if you just contemplate just one simple fact that Maggie Beer has put out there in her recent little documentary on improving nutrition, is that 60% of people in aged care are either malnourished or in danger of being malnourished. So imagine in the childcare setting, if this were the equivalent, there would be an uproar. But there is something about aging that just makes it okay. It makes it okay for abuse to be perpetrated. Like in aged care, there are 50 sexual assaults taking place a week, according to the Aged Care Royal Commission. Who is marching? Who is marching to stop this? Who is marching to stop the repeat perpetrators? And we know there are repeat perpetrators. The fact that KPMG could undertake research for the federal government in the lead up to the implementation of the Serious Incident Response Scheme, for aged care providers to say that sexual assault had no impact on 58% of victims. So that is completely mind-boggling and speaks to how ignorant we remain on issues of violence against older women.
Yeah, that's horrific. And we also know too that the way predators, and that's really what we're talking about here with those repeat offenders, the way predators used to move around churches and they would go from church to church, from parish to parish, that's essentially what they're doing now in aged care. And for the same reasons, that there is no regulation, there is nobody monitoring it, there is nowhere to report it, there is no accountability and no responsibility. And so repeat offenders are just quietly moved on and they just go into another aged care home. And if we look back at what happened eventually when all that came out and all those people who were not just committing those horrific crimes, but covering up that Royal Commission into institutionalised responses to child sexual abuse, we're just setting up another one of those. And in the meantime, thousands and thousands of older people, and as you say, most of them older women, are going to be sexually assaulted, and no one will know and no one will care and no one will help them.
Yes, you're talking about the category of aged care workers, and there is no national registry, for example, but there are also resident-on-resident perpetration as well. And that includes residents who are cognitively impaired. If you know that that block is a serial offender, what are you doing to stop him? A manager in a sexual assault unit told me about a woman who is nearly 90 who was brought in, who was raped by one of these serial offenders, an older man with dementia. She's not his first victim, and neither will she be the last, because no steps have been taken to restrain him.
Awful. I remember I did actually go to an aged care group once to suggest that we deliver consent education to the staff and to the residents, age appropriate. So I do high schools, but we can turn it age appropriate for people in aged care. And they told me that they couldn't do it because a direct quote, "Oh, they're all too old to be interested in sex," was one thing they told me, and the families won't like it, meaning that if you go and tell somebody's son or daughter or child that we need to deliver consent education to your parents in aged care and to the other people in the aged care centre, that will mean that those kids have to think about their elderly parents thinking about sex, wanting sex or having sex, and they won't be able to deal with it. And these are paying customers and we don't want to upset them, so let's just pretend it's not happening. Now, they didn't say that last part about the pretend it's not happening out loud, but they said all the rest of it to me. And it's just that same thing that I remember reading about and listening to in the submissions to the Royal Commission about the institutional responses to child sexual abuse, was just people saying, no, it doesn't happen here. It's not us. It's happening somewhere else. It's not real. I don't want to listen. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to talk about it. Go away.
Yes, absolutely. Everything that you said is not surprising to me. We developed some training resources with Dr. Catherine Barrett on building the capacity of aged care providers with different units, training modules, etc. But it's really difficult to get aged care providers to buy into this, i.e. it is free, but for them to get their staff to do this and to take it seriously. So this is just one part of it. You have the other part in the community. These days, you have fantastic Chanel contours saying you need to teach consent in schools. But who's teaching consent to older people, to the men who married at the time when rape in marriage was not a crime? So, you can't automatically assume that the very next day that the legislation is passed, that all behavior changes. So I think we need to recognize that we have a cohort who is completely forgotten in talking about how do we make this a safer place for all of us, and that includes older women. So all the stereotypes about the nasty, wicked grandmother in fairy tales, in Snow White, they all just serve to perpetrate an idea of an older woman who is a hateful figure, who you don't have to care for, and who you can laugh at. So all of this is so damaging to seeing older women as individuals in their own right, who lead really rich lives, who contribute to society, who deserve what Australians say, a fair go.
I completely agree. And I think it's also really interesting that the old woman, the wicked old witch, is one of the few stereotypes of women that is completely unsexualized. Old women have no sexuality. Older women are removed from any sexual agency, and the very idea, as I said, these aged care people saying, well, adult children don't want to hear that their parents want to have sex.
Yes.
So it becomes something that we can't even discuss. And again, it's that same stereotypical myth of an older woman who is no longer the young, desirable woman. And because women's sexuality is passive and it's about being sexually appealing to men are taught to not find older women sexually attractive, so therefore nobody does, so therefore they're not sexual. So the whole idea of reproductive care, of consent, of safe sex, and of protection from sexual violence is all assumed to be just not relevant to older women. And Well, I have lots of issues with the way we collect data on violence in Australia. Certainly the data that we have says that absolutely older women are victimised by sexual predators, both people that they're married to and people that they know and people who are caring for them and strangers as well.
Yes, I think the thing about data collection with regards to violence against women or anything else that you can think about, if you were to look at how they gather data and you look at the age range that they discriminate the cohorts like 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 44 to 55, and then 55 and above, and that's it. So you're all lumped into this huge clump and assuming that a woman who's 56 has the same needs and wants and all of that, the same as someone who is 89 years old, which is just ridiculous. We need to be seen in all our differences and across our lifespan properly, and not just as over 55. She's in the over 55 group. So let's just park them there in that corner and that's it, really.
Shut the door and forget about them. Absolutely. The other thing I find really interesting is their personal safety survey, which is where we get almost all of the data about violence in Australia. So anytime you hear anybody over the age of 15, that means that this data comes from the personal safety survey. They specifically exclude anybody living in aged care or residential care from that survey. So it's absolutely, we do not include any experiences of, as you say, mostly women living not just in aged care, but in retirement villages, anything that isn't a private dwelling, they're not included. They are specifically excluded from this study. So we know what we don't know, which is that we really don't know the experiences of violence that older women are having to deal with. And we also know, and I read a study on this a while ago, that when older women do try and report to police that somebody is hurting them or abusing them, that unless that person is a stranger, the chances that a police officer will dismiss them as senile is at least 1 in 3. That's 1 in 3. And that's of the police officers who believe anyone who comes in with a story about sexual violence. And it's that added one on top of it of, oh, well, you're old, so you're probably senile.
Not at all surprising, given all the stories that we have heard. In the first place, getting police to actually lodge a report of a woman who has experienced assault, especially sexual assault, is difficult enough. Karen Iles is leading a campaign saying to get the police just to note that in a report. So if you layer that with the intersectionality of race, of age, of ability, then it becomes even more of an insurmountable challenge to get justice for if you are assaulted, if you are older, if you are from First Nations, if you have some form of a disability. So as you know, I think I've spoken before about older women in aged care who report that they have been sexually assaulted. It's virtually impossible for them to be believed, especially if they have some level of cognitive impairment. And so it's very easy for aged care staff to say, oh, they've got a UTI, or for police to say, oh, she's having a rape fantasy. So all of these things have actually been said before. It is, given all of these stereotypes that we carry in our head about older women being asexual, therefore not able to experience any form of either sexual pleasure or sexual assault. So all of that is harmful, really. And in relation to that wicked stepmother and all that whole thing about an older woman being jealous of younger women's youth and wanting to block that is a stereotype that continues in our advertising today, in the way that we portray older women. So it's not just something that's a few hundred years old. It is very much alive today. And that feeds into the resentment that younger people feel towards older people, and that includes older women.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's a real profit motive in capitalism exploiting that fear of aging, because the anti-aging industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry across the world. So imagine what would happen to that industry if all the women in the world who are over 50 suddenly went, yeah, I'm good with it. I look great. I feel great. Having a good life. Don't need any of your lotions and potions. Put your shit away. I'm going out to have fun. Like, they would lose billions and billions of dollars. So there's a real, genuine, structural, capitalism-driven problem with being able to say, yes, I'm looking older because the only way to look 24 is to be 24. And I'm not 24 anymore, and I look like that, and that's good. Because it's interesting how it's not an issue for men. And this is how clearly we can know that women are being exploited in this way, is men do not have the same issues with aging that women do. When I talk to men that I know who are getting a bit older, they'll tell me about things like, oh, the hangovers are really bad, or I can't play footy the way I used to. They're talking about the things they can't do anymore. But when you talk to them about how they look, some of them will just say, oh, I look the same as I always did. Or they will say, oh, yeah, going a bit grey around the edges, but it's fine. They don't have that feeling that women have, which is that it's almost shame. It's a very deep shame, in fact, that they have failed to hold on to their youth and desirability, which is embodied in youth, in these fairy tales that we're talking about, and in those really profit-driven, forced understanding of what a good woman is. And a good woman is young and attractive and passive and submissive. And if you are not any of those things, and I think that's the other problem that men have with older women, I don't know any women who, as they get older, didn't get more confident eventually, weren't able to stand up for themselves more, weren't able to say, you know what, I'm just sick of your shit and I'm not putting up with it anymore, far more easily. Far less patience for ego-driven rubbish from other people. All those things that happen as you get older are a huge threat to, well, umbrella term being the patriarchy, which needs women to be submissive and stay home and dance with a broomstick and sing about how much fun it is to do unpaid domestic labour.
Jean, I'd just like to make a few comments in relation to that. The first, I completely agree with you. Men become silver foxes. They look more gorgeous as they're older. They're made to be that. Look at George Clooney. He looks so much nicer with all his grey now than he did when he was younger. They look distinguished. All of these terms are used to describe older men, whereas older women is like old crone, old hag, old bag, all of these derogatory terms that are used. And so it is pathological. We are just pushed to desiring youth because aging is seen as a scary place for older women. And this has real implications also in terms of work. We run a special program called Pathways to Employment, where we assist older women one-on-one to help them to get back to the workforce. And the number of them who tell us we are too old and they will not consider us for the job is almost universal. Because the workplace is ageist as well. I can't tell you the number of older women who are working, professional older women who tell me, Yumi, I wish I could just stop dyeing my hair, but I can't because I know what it will mean. I will pay the penalty with promotions, etc. in my work. So sometimes they're forced by the systemic discrimination to do all of these things. But that's the first comment I'd like to make. And the second one, in relation to flipping the bird and saying, okay, I've had enough. I'm not going to put up with any of this nonsense. I think that point, you can only take that stand. A lot of women feel they can only take that stand if they have the resources to do so. I recall going to a meeting where an older woman told me that even to attend that meeting that cost $5 for afternoon tea, that she had to get permission from her husband.
Wow.
And she is unable to say, I've had enough of this. I want an independent life. I want to be able to make my own decisions, especially when you have a structure out there in the home that does not support you to make that decision. We know the single age pension is below the poverty line. We know the severe lack of affordable housing. So you put up with having to ask permission to go for afternoon tea for $5 than saying, I want to be independent, because being independent is just not possible for some women.
See, and that's another one of the things that just drives me nuts about the wicked old witch myth. And when I was writing the Fairy Tale Princesses book, I read a lot of fairy tales. I only retold 5 of them in the book, but in almost all of them, universally, the wicked old witch is the villain in almost every single fairy tale. And then I think about the people who are actually protecting girls and young women, usually from the white knights and handsome princes are the ones that they need the protection from. And in almost all cases, it's older women. So I've worked in a lot and been in a lot more of domestic violence shelters and crisis response centres and rape crisis centres. And you look around all those rooms, and while there's certainly some young women there, they are learning from the older women who are in the room, and it is the older women who are managing that work.
Yes.
It is actually older women who are mentoring young women in their careers, who are counselling them to maintain financial independence, so that exactly that situation you're talking about, Yumi, so that they're not stuck one day asking permission to have $5 to go for afternoon tea. And talking to young women about how important it is to do things like maintain your own bank account, maintain your financial independence. A man is not a financial plan. Look after your career, and yourself and your future will look after itself. These are all things that older women say to younger women.
Absolutely.
That idea that older women are the threat to younger women, they're not. They're actually the protection that younger women need. And when young women are taught to fear aging, and to be afraid of not only getting older themselves, but of older women's jealousy, because that's the myth. All older women are really jealous and angry with young women, which is it's just bullshit. But it does so much harm because it's another means of separating them from the very people who will protect them from exactly that situation that you were just talking about.
Yes, I think you've raised an important point. A lot of the women who work in this domestic violence field in social work, a fair number of them are older women, and that carries a penalty for the older women themselves because these professions are quite poorly paid. And the other thing to note is it's not only in the professional sphere, but tell me the number of mothers and grandmothers who are taking in their daughters and granddaughters who are fleeing domestic violence situation. They're giving up parts of their career. They're going to part-time work to care for children and grandchildren. So they carry the penalty as well. It's not just in the professional sphere, it's also in their personal lives. So that's one part of the equation. And then think, in the domestic violence situation where, let's say, the man is forced to leave the family home, where does he go? He goes back to his mother. And I can't tell you the number of older women who say, we are afraid and we don't know how to deal with his anger, with their son's anger issues, and they feel threatened. So all of these things are not at the forefront when we talk about domestic and family violence, because often the focus is on younger women and their children fleeing violence. All of these relationships, the ecosystem of violence where older women play a part, are frequently forgotten.
That's absolutely true. And that is a really interesting point about those violent men going home to mum, enacting that violence against her. And I think it's that I come up against this all the time in all parts of my work, that it always feels like within the sector that are trying to support all of the people who are affected by gender-based violence, it's like a competition. Do we fund younger women or older women? Do we fund children or aged care residents? Do we fund families or perpetrators? Like, we have to make a choice. Like, we get one little pot of funding and it only goes to one group of people and everybody else has to look on angrily and then complain. Instead of actually saying, well, this is a community-wide from cradle to the grave problem, and all of it needs funding. And all of it needs resources and all of it needs support. And while we only do it piecemeal and siloed, we're never actually going to solve the problem. So little bits and pieces scattered out in clumps And then we say, well, we funded that for 2.5 years and nothing changed, so it doesn't work. So we'll stop funding that and start funding something else. And then we'll go over here, and then we'll go over here, and then we'll jump to the other side of the country and say, hey, WA suddenly come to the party. Let's go and see what they're doing. And not actually say, well, we are talking about a deeply entrenched problem that runs over the course of an entire lifetime. And we can't solve it by sectioning people into chunks and saying, well, we've addressed sexual violence against women between the ages of 18 to 24, so yes, that solves the problem. It doesn't. It just delays the problem.
Couldn't agree with you more, because what's happening is that we're all eyeing a very small pie to deal with a national crisis. And it really irks me to think that we can just splurge $376 billion on nuclear submarines. And here we are scrambling for crumbs to deal with literally a life and death situation for women and their children. So it is so unedifying that we're having to scramble and fight amongst ourselves and say who is more deserving, who is less deserving, which is the more deserving cohort, etc. In fact, it should be a multi-pronged, multi-dimensional, fully funded approach to ending violence against women, because it will benefit us all when we live in a safe, nurturing, and compassionate society.
I completely agree. Again, we're just agreeing with each other all over the place here. And the other argument that I come up against when I say this is people saying, oh, well, it will cost too much, because it will cost billions. But back in 2016, KPMG did a study on the economic cost of violence against women. And 2016, so 8 years ago, they said it was costing $11 billion every year. So that cost has not gone down. And if the cost of living, we all know the cost of living, the cost of being abused is going up as well. So the capacity to save, if we're going to talk about it in economic costs, the capacity to save money by investing in a systems-wide action, cradle to the grave for all genders, actually saves a huge amount just in economic terms. And I don't like talking about it in economic terms, because this is people's lives, this is people's futures, this is their very ability to keep living, but also their ability to not just keep living, but to keep living well and happily. And we know the effects of trauma, and that, it does last a lifetime. Things that happen to children when they're 4 or 5 are still with them when they're in aged care in their 90s. And they still remember those things, and it has affected them for their entire lives. And change what they could have been had an impact on not always on stopping people fulfilling their potential, but just making it so much harder to do all that work to reach their greatest potential, and causing real difficulty in so many areas that are often just not measured, because, again, we silo it. So we talk about the economic terms, or the psychological cost, or the financial cost to the specific people involved, the social cost. But when we put all that cost together, if we spent that $11 billion a year on fixing all those groups, as you say, not looking for the most deserving cohort, but looking for all cohorts. Who needs help, and what help do they need, and how can we give it to them best? What do they say about what is going to be best for them, and how do we work with them to make sure that that happens? Nobody loses out of that.
That's right, Jane. But I think also underpinning all of that is having a deep questioning mind as to how can we turn the level of misogyny in this country down. Because I just give you a simple example. We have a radio host in Sydney. I think they tried to expand to Melbourne.
Yeah, I think we booted them.
Yes, at the level of misogyny, it's unbelievable. We can't even repeat what it is that he says so freely on his radio program, which is listened to by a fair amount of people, because I understand in Sydney, they're the #1 radio station that's listened to in the morning. And that's completely horrifying. I just cannot understand how people can get away with saying things like that, because that everything that he says just perpetuates misogyny and stereotypes of women as nothing more than bodies for the use and abuse of men.
Absolutely. And I think it also perpetuates stereotypes of men as being crude buffoons who think it's funny to assault women. And it's certainly true of him. It's certainly true of the persona that he portrays. And I think it's true of, from what I've seen of the data and what I've seen of the work that I've done, about 25% roughly of the population actually really buy into those beliefs, or sorry, 25% of men really buy into those beliefs, which means actually the majority of men don't. But if you have that in, say, a classroom, which is where I've spent a lot of my time over the last few years, or in a workplace or in an aged care centre, but a classroom's an easy one because you've got a standard number of kids. So say you've got 25 kids in a class, 13 of them, say, in a co-ed class of boys, that means 3 or 4 boys on average in every single classroom believe those really deep misogynistic hatred and contempt of women things, and also think that the way that they should express that is loudly and performatively for each other against any women or girls in the room. And the majority of boys, and I've watched this happen so many times, the majority of boys in those classrooms sit there horrified and disgusted, but silent, because they know they will be punished if they disagree.
Yes, that's right. So there's a long way to go.
Yeah, because I think that happens in workplaces too. In fact, I know it happens in workplaces too. Again, I've seen it. You talk to some of the union reps about some of the things that they see, and particularly in those male-dominated workforces where you're starting to see women coming in now, but they're in the minority. Some of the things that happen there are just truly awful. And again, it's that minority of men, that loud, brash, crude, awful minority of men shaming the majority of men into silence. And I think what we really need to do is find a way to reach that majority and say, speak up. You have a role to play here. Don't just stay there silent and afraid of being called weak or all the names that they call men who don't buy into that masculinity ideal. Be proud of that. That is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. And stand up and be part of the solution, because that's also something to be proud of.
Yes, I think that leadership, Jane, has to be driven from the top. That whole parliamentary culture that was exposed by Kate Jenkins in her report, the fact that nobody has been held to account for their bullying behavior, for their sexual harassment, for their sexual assault. To this day, we have not heard anyone being held to account, is very disturbing. And I'm not sure if you have read in the Broad Agenda an article written by a woman who was sexually assaulted by a parliamentarian's chief of staff. And she has said that nothing much has changed in Parliament. So if you have the top layer of leadership, political leadership in our country, not showing that they're taking this issue seriously, I think it leaves us in a much poorer situation in having to deal with it here at the grassroots.
There seems to be a disconnect between looking at those fairy tales that they're from a bygone age, that wicked old witch trope is from the Grimm brothers who were writing in the 1860s. And even the Snow White movie, I think, came out in 1920-something, 1930-something. So it can feel like it's from another world. Things aren't like that anymore. And I just wanted to, just before we wrap up, just talk a little bit about the way those myths have been repackaged for the digital age. So the things that we see around us in 2024 in Australia that are still reinforcing that wicked old witch myth, that idea that women who are older are both irrelevant and dangerous at the same time. You're both invisible, you shouldn't be taken any notice of, you don't exist, you're not important, but you're also a real threat because you're a wicked old witch. So how are we still seeing that now?
I'll give you just one example of a news.com article about housing in Australia. And it says that the boomers are the cause of the housing crisis that we have. And the photograph that they used to illustrate this were of 3 older women dressed in beautiful satin outfits, holding up glasses of wine and smiling towards the camera. Now, this could not be further from the truth when you look at who's the fastest growing cohort amongst the homeless, the fact that 500,000 older women live in permanent income poverty. So, dressing up the boomers as these three older women who are depriving younger people of housing is just one of the thousands of ways where they use the stereotype of older women as hateful figures to perpetuate this divide between younger people and older people, and to diminish the importance of older women as individuals in their own right.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because those older women, the women from the boomer generation, they were not allowed to have their own bank accounts under their own names when they first became adults. They were not allowed to take out mortgages. They were not allowed to start businesses without a man's permission as in a signature on a form. So the idea that those women are the ones who are retaining wealth away from the young people is, it's crazy. But that's a really interesting way of finishing up, I think, Yumi, because you've taken us full circle from the wicked old witch in the Snow White mist to the wicked old boomers on the current advertising. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a great conversation. I really appreciate your wisdom and your experience and your knowledge and your fabulousness.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yumi. That was Yumi Lee, CEO of the Older Women's Network. This was episode 1 of Fairytale Princesses Will Kill Your Children podcast. There are 6 episodes in total. Don't forget, if you want to buy the Fairytale Princesses Will Kill Your Children book, you can get it direct from my website if you're in Australia, or from your preferred online bookseller anywhere else. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week to talk about Cinderella and the value of women's work with Will Strachey, Assistant Secretary of the Victorian Trades Hall Council.
Some of them, they're very bound up in the gender norms, the notion that men do certain kind of work, women do certain kind of work, and they're very bound up in that. So they say, women don't want to do certain kinds of work, right? But if women wanted to earn more, they should just go and do the work that we're doing.